So welcome. This is our webinar on international charity and development sector, navigating the employment landscape following the pandemic. So the webinar really is just designed to take a look at the different trends we're currently seeing in your sector, just where the pressures are coming from, and then take a look at the 3 common arrangements that carry sort of unique challenges, but also have a level of shared risk as well. But ultimately, we're looking really just to highlight how these can actually add value to an organisation and how to manage those risks from a practical point of view as well.
So just a little bit about who we are. Blick Rothenberg is a tax, accounting and business advisory firm that puts our people and client relationships first. Our award-winning global mobility team is one of the largest specialist teams in the UK. We are part of the Lineal Global Network, which is a network of accountancy firms across the globe, which gives us global coverage. Across the firm, we work with over 200 clients, both nationally and internationally, in the charity and development space.
So how did we get here? Even before the start of the pandemic, there was a move away from traditional working arrangements and traditional assignment types, such as sending someone on a 2-year assignment. And I think this, has continued post-pandemic. Initially, this seems to have been driven by, the availability of cheaper travel and also advancements in technology. So it meant it was easier for people to work outside of their traditional office type space. Lockdown has accelerated this trend, with organisations having to provide technology for people to work from home in order for people to continue to work during the pandemic, and also being driven by people wanting to work closer to their families during what's been a difficult time for a lot of people. Even though we're now starting to come out of the pandemic, it looks as though this trend is here to stay. Now that working from home has kind of been instigated, it's quite difficult to unwind that and take that away from people. And as well, it seems like there's been an employee mindset shift, whereas, during the pandemic, people took time to step back and reflect about their priorities and, what they wanted out of work and what their work-life balance they wanted that to look like.
So for the changing employment environment, we're just going to take a look at 3 main types of employment arrangements that we're seeing, and these are the trend that we've picked up as being much more common these days. So we'll take a look at the first one now. So for global remote workers, what do we mean by that in particular? So this is anyone that works or performs their duties in a country that differs to where the organisation's offices are based. So specifically the international element we're looking at here. And in general, as a concept, tax residence, or where an individual would pay tax, is established with reference to their physical presence. So that poses a problem for remote workers, as often they'll break tax residence in the country that they're employed in and then establish tax residence in a different country. It's important just to note that tax residence rules do vary quite dramatically between different countries. So that's just a rule of thumb, but different rules could end up with people having to pay tax in both countries, for example, and then relying on various treaties to sort that out. The several risks that are posed with this type of arrangement is obviously the first one being tax, and that's where tax is actually due. So we see that from an employee perspective, tax is generally due where the individual is physically working, which in itself is a personal employee issue. However, it does have knock-on effects for the organisation too. So, for example, some jurisdictions will require a registered entity is registered, whereas other territories will just simply allow for a gross payment to be made to that individual to sort their own taxes out in the country that they're working. The secondary issue from that, if there are multiple entities, who's required to pay the tax. So, for example, we see in countries like Madagascar, it's actually not possible to be employed via an overseas non-registered entity. So therefore, if you had a global remote worker in Madagascar, it would require the registration of an entity and a payroll in order to facilitate that employment in Madagascar. The second one being social security. So if there's a social security arrangement between 2 countries, usually the social security liability will fall in the country where the work is completed. That often then normally comes with a requirement to register a payroll and pay employer contributions via a payroll. We see that most common in Europe just because of the agreement we have with the EU, which is still ongoing at the moment. And then there are also things such as certificate of coverages, which are an option to manage some of those risks. But again, that does often come with some limitations or different considerations before they're absolutely granted. Thirdly, we saw lots of concessions during COVID and across the pandemic. So as an example, Germany allowed for social security to be waived for workers that were in Germany, and that was on a temporary basis, just whilst they were stuck there for the pandemic. But we're actually seeing a lot of these concessions starting to fall away, and also they were often quite informal, so they weren't written into any form of legislation. So it's important that we don't just rely or assume that it's going to be fine to continue as we have been as we come out of the pandemic. The next next risk that we see is permanent establishment risk. So this is where there is a potential to establish a corporate presence for the company in the employee's physical locations. There's a variety of factors which can affect this, and we see often it's due to the seniority of the individual, the activity that they're doing, the length of time that they're there, or often sometimes the number of assignees that are actually working remotely from that country. So all of those things need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Another risk we see is HR management. So as we know, it's important for the organisations to have a good handle on where their employees are physically working. But just because of the rapid shift from the pandemic, we see that often a lot of organisations don't actually have appropriate systems, policies, or processes in place just to track the whereabouts of their workforce. So that's a significant risk as well that we see. And just the final two risks, employment law. So actually local employment laws and statutory allowances will apply when working in overseas territories. So it's important just to make sure that any employment contracts that you have would actually meet the minimum statutory requirements of the overseas location. So we've done many of these exercises where once organisations have a good handle on their workforce and where they're actually physically working, we'll go and do an assessment to look at the statutory minimum requirements of each contract in each country. An example that we can give here is sort of in France, it's mandatory to provide employees with medical insurance, and that works very similar to the way in the UK with automatic enrolment. So employees that are ordinarily working in the UK have to be automatically enrolled into a pension scheme, and so similar things exist in various countries that we need to be aware of. And just finally, reputational risk for non-compliance. We tend to see that both charity and development sectors are often held to a higher standard just because of the ethical considerations of it. So it's important just to make sure that we're sort of looking at those things up front. So while that sounds like quite a lot of risks, I appreciate there are many opportunities in these, particularly being able to hire from a significantly increased talent pool. As Vicky mentioned, the employee work-life balance is improved, and you often see that you have higher employee engagement when they are allowed to work from an agile environment. And then finally, we just say that there are also some cost savings involved with less office space required to reduce the organisation's overheads, but also the differing tax and social security regimes actually may be beneficial. You might have an employee working in a country with a lower tax rate and statutory allowances and things like that. So overall, our recommendations for anyone with global remote workers would, first of all, just to really have a good handle on where your employers are working. If you're allowing employees to work remotely, then it's just important from that point, once you've got a good handle on it, to then assess the tax, social security, and statutory risk that your organisation faces. Longer term, we'd recommend having a policy in place that's in line with your organisation's operational needs. So some organisations might just prefer to have a policy which completely disallows it, or they might prefer to have one of these other employment engagements, which we'll speak about in the next slides. I think we'll just go to our first poll. So we're going to run a poll which the title is, are you considering implementing a global remote working policy in the next 12 months? It's looking like a pretty even 50-50 split at the moment. Perfect.
I think for me that makes sense because we're still coming out of the pandemic, and I think there's still quite a lot of understanding where people are and how people want to work going on at the moment. So it could be that over the next 12 months, plans become more concrete, and then it's more likely that some kind of policy is required.
So I'll be just talking about commuters. So the first point is, what are commuters? So a commuter is an employee who works in a host country but travels back to their home country on a frequent basis and maintains their home country residence. The commuter's principal residence remains in their home country, their family remain in their home country, and they return to their home frequently, usually once a week. For example, an employee may be living in the UK with their family but working in the Netherlands. The commuter would typically travel to the Netherlands on a Sunday evening and return to the UK on a Thursday. The general trend is that commuter assignments are on the rise. This has largely been driven by personal circumstances, as we see a shift away from long-term assignments, as employees do not want to uproot their families or disrupt their children's education. In the charity and development sector, we see another variation of this called deployments. So this may be where someone is living in their home country but deployed to another country, which may be on a short-term basis for a couple of weeks, or maybe on a longer-term basis for a few months. So some of the risks associated with commuter assignments are similar to some of the risks you see with global remote workers. For example, you still have the permanent establishment risk, where it's important to track the role and duties performed overseas in order to avoid inadvertently creating a corporate presence in the other country. And to do this, you may be looking at things like how you're recharging costs, having a strong secondment agreement in place. There's also the management of computer assignments is still largely informal. Many organizations still do not have a formal policy or practices in place to enable them to manage their commuter population. This can lead to a number of risks, as employees may not know what their employees are doing in other countries or how long the employees are spending in the country. So they may trigger certain thresholds which the company may not understand or know when this has happened. Again, there's also often not a system in place for tracking their commuters, which can expose the organization to various compliance risks. There's also the financial consideration. So it's often thought that commuter assignments are generally more cost effective than long-term assignments. But when you then have to consider the travel costs, as the commuter is often going to have to travel more often, the accommodation costs, as you're going to have to retain available accommodation in the host country, and the cost of tax support, you can see that costs can sometimes rack up quicker than you'd expect. You'd also need to consider the management of tax, social security, immigration, and payroll consideration for the commuter assignees. And some of the opportunities which we have seen are commuter assignments can remove some of the barriers to long-term assignments, as employees do not have to uproot their whole family, which may have an adverse impact on their partner's career, for example, or on their children's education, as discussed previously. This means that employees may be more likely or more willing to go on a commuter assignment than to go on a traditional long-term assignment. It also helps businesses fulfill their organizational needs, as in getting the right people in the right places. And commuter assignments are often quicker to implement than traditional assignments, as they often remove some of the red tape and long waiting times to get approval for traditional long-term assignments. Some of the recommendations we have with commuter assignments are ensuring policies and procedures are in place for managing the commuter population, offering clear direction on the support on offer to your commuter population, and always consulting a tax advisor on compliant risks and requirements for your commuter assignments. And this leads us to our second goal, which is, do you have a system in place to track the location of your workforce? So there's a more positive. Oh wait, we're still going. So again, we have another 50-50 split on whether there are systems in place to track the workloads, and this is often what we're seeing. Often many companies have not yet implemented a solid foundation for tracking their employees, and it is something which we work with a lot of our clients in implementing, as it is often one of the key considerations for when employees reach a threshold where they may be tax due, for example, in a specific jurisdiction.
And tracking can be hard because, especially if it's on shorter term travel, it's like, how do you know people are moving, and what kind of systems, can you utilize systems you already have in place to kind of track your people? For example, are there like travel expense systems that you can use, or one of the kind of old school ways we've seen clients track is to have sign-in books at reception, which practically might not always be an option depending if you don't have an office space in certain countries, or if you're going out on, or someone's going on a project which is quite remote, that it's like that tracking kind of gets very difficult. So the next arrangement we want to talk about is short-term travelers. Short-term travelers are, well, they're usually not on formal assignment, so it could be for ad hoc travel, for meetings, training, etc. So kind of common real world examples we see of short-term travelers are visiting fundraising events, attending conferences or training, or kind of senior team meetings. So I'm going to flip this around and talk about the opportunities for short-term travelers rather than the risks first. So obviously it's very flexible. It's quite easy to get people where you need if they're just going for a couple of days. From a financial perspective, they're quite low cost arrangements because all you need to sort out is some travel expenses. And in terms of policy, it's quite often there doesn't have to be a formal policy in place just because people are traveling for such a short length of time. I think part of the risk associated with short-term travelers is, as I alluded to before, it can be quite difficult to know where they are because they're going for such a short length of time. There might not be a need to kind of get approval from, say, HR or finance. So who is tracking if people are traveling and where they're going? So that can be quite difficult. And there's different reporting obligations in different countries for short-term travelers. So in the UK, for example, HMRC have got short-term business visitor agreements in place to track short-term travelers. So that's kind of quite a well-known one, but other countries also have various reporting obligations. And again, because it's often the travel is for such a short period of time, it can be easy to assume that there's actually no reporting obligations required when that's not necessarily always the case. Another risk is immigration. Again, because they're short term, it can be quite easy to gloss over that, some kind of visa might be needed, especially in this post-Brexit world that we're living in, and we're also kind of coming to terms with what we need to do to get people traveling into Europe again. So in summary, I think with your short-term travelers, obviously they're great, let's get people where you need for short periods, but there's still kind of compliance reporting obligations associated with that. And I think the main kind of concern is, do you have systems in place to track people? And it's partly a bit of a business education need because, again, HR and finance might think, great, send people where we want to go for short periods, but not necessarily think of kind of reporting obligations associated with that.
So in summary, we wanted to just cover off so that it might seem that there are a lot of risks. Less formal assignments are on the rise. They're flexible, they're more inclusive, they offer you the ability to attract a wider talent pool. However, they're all easily managed. So despite the risks, with proper policy, it's easy to manage. And also it's important that employees are educated, first of all, on the policies, but also the risks too. If employees are just simply aware that there might be a risk of them attending a business meeting in the USA, then they'll be much more inclined to notify whoever it needs to be in your organization to do so. So I guess, although it's a big topic and there is a lot to consider, our first step would recommendation would always be just to be able to identify easily where your employees are and help them understand what the risks are and where the obligations lie as well.
Okay, so now we've got time for some questions. So one that came through earlier is, if we get a process in place, can we just roll that out to kind of every country where we may have some workers? And I think from my point of view, while getting the process in place is great, and it probably can be rolled out to kind of your different countries, because you don't want to kind of start a new process for every single location where you might have, like, say, remote workers, etc. It's probably still good to have a quick sense check with some kind of a local tax advisor, just to make sure all the risks are being captured, because as we discussed earlier, the risk can be different from country to country, as unfortunately the legislation is different to country. So it's difficult to have a completely one size fits all solution, but what we can do is kind of make it as simple and straightforward as possible, so it is easy to roll out in various locations. Another question that we've had is, as this is quite a new topic as we're coming out of the pandemic, what would be the kind of one key thing we should think about?
So here's where I'd probably go back to just making sure you've got a good handle on where your employees are located, because the risks are different. When we see people trying to put policies in place, often what they'll try and do first of all is just look at their core areas of risk, countries that their employees seem to be working as a base or go to frequently, and you can start from that point and build out as your workforce grows and develops. But I think the first step is always to be just to find out where your employees are working, what employment arrangement are they working on, because often we see that employees, because they're not aware of the risks themselves, they just don't think to mention the fact they're actually traveling or working remotely from different locations. They might have read some poor advice on the internet and thinking that it's fine to do so. So I guess first step, identify where your employees are, and secondly, make sure that your employees are educated as well.
So I think then it's a summary, just to wrap up after the questions. Especially thank you all for your time. We appreciate this is a big topic that we've kind of flown through quite quickly. So if you do have any follow-up questions that occur to you after we finish the webinar, please do get in touch. Our contact details are on the screen. And thank you very much for your time.